They called him the Colossus, not for the wars he had won, but for what he concealed beneath his armor. And every woman who discovered the truth either wept, laughed, or vanished before dawn. King Dennis Harrow stood 6 feet 9 inches of battle-scarred muscle and absolute command. An alpha whose very footsteps silenced corridors. A king whose amber eyes could end arguments before words were spoken. Yet beneath the crown festered a secret that no conquest could bury. He was the most rejected man in 7 territories. 19 noblewomen in 4 years. 19. Some fled mid-introduction. Some dissolved into humiliating laughter. One sent back his ring with a note that simply read, "Impossible." They whispered his name across every court from the Iron Veil battlements to the southern Salt provinces, not as a curse, not for cruelty, but for a physical nature so staggeringly, impossibly proportioned that no high-born woman had ever been brave enough to stay. The Colossus of Iron Veil, a king built to conquer everything except loneliness. Tonight the 19th ring sat cold on his throne room floor. But tonight something else was coming. Now let's return to the moment everything changed. The rain had transformed the palace courtyard into a treacherous river of slick stone and guttering torchlight. Through the darkness, past the iron gates, a flash of pale linen, copper curls plastered to tear-streaked cheeks, and storm-gray eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who has run completely out of road. She didn't slow when she saw him. She ran toward him. Chapter 1. The 19th ring had been returned by courier, not even in person. Lady Mireille of the Salt provinces hadn't possessed the courtesy to face him. She'd simply dispatched a servant boy, no older than 12, clutching a velvet pouch and a folded note that Dennis didn't bother reading. He already knew what it said. They all said the same thing, dressed in different words. He dropped the ring into the iron box beneath his war table. It landed among the others with a sound like a small, hollow death. His council was still talking. They had been talking for the better part of an hour, arranged around the great obsidian table like carrion birds, debating which part of a carcass to claim first. Lord Fenwick suggested the eastern reaches. There were daughters of merchant lords there, less particular than the nobility, more practical about the business of alliance. General Hark proposed widening the search beyond the 7 territories entirely. Perhaps a foreign match, perhaps someone who hadn't yet heard. Lady Council Dre, the oldest among them and the only one with the dignity to look uncomfortable, said nothing at all. Dennis stood at the window with his back to all of them. Outside, Iron Veil stretched in every direction. His. Every watchtower, every cobblestone, every lit hearth visible from this height belonged to him. He had built half of it with his own hands during the Reconstruction. He had bled for the other half in wars that lesser kings had started and abandoned. There was not a corner of this fortress that did not bear some mark of his will. And there was not a single room in it that held anyone waiting for him. "Your Majesty," Fenwick's voice, carefully neutral, "we should begin identifying candidates before the winter court. Appearances must be maintained. The council believes—" "The council," Dennis said quietly, "can believe whatever it likes." Silence dropped over the room like a stone into still water. He turned then, and that was enough. Just the turning, just the full weight of him filling the doorway of his own attention. 6'9" of iron-dense muscle, amber eyes that had stared down charging cavalry without blinking, a jaw set so hard it could have been carved from the same granite as his walls. His council, to their credit, did not flinch. They had learned not to. But they did go very, very still. "We're finished here," he said. They filed out without another word. He walked the fortress alone after that, as he always did. Through the eastern corridor where the torches burned low, past the armory, down into the training yard, where his breath misted in the cold night air. The whispers followed him the way they always did, not spoken aloud, not anymore, but carried in every carefully averted gaze, every conversation that ended a beat too quickly when he entered a room. Too much, too large, too cursed. A king who had conquered everything. Except this, Chapter 2. He heard her before he saw her. A crash of iron against iron. The eastern courtyard gate taking a hit it wasn't built to absorb. And then the sound of bare feet slapping against wet stone, desperate and uneven. The rhythm of someone running on the last reserves of something that had almost entirely run out. Dennis was already moving before the second sound registered. Not toward safety. Toward it. She came through the gate like something. The storm had torn loose and flung forward. A girl, small and wild-haired, copper curls roped dark with rain against her cheeks and neck. A torn linen dress that had once been white clinging to a frame that was shaking so hard he could see it from 30 feet away. There was blood on her arm. A gash from wrist to elbow, not deep enough to be fatal, but red and raw and ignored entirely, as though she had more urgent things to attend to than her own body falling apart. 2 men came through the gate behind her. Large men, syndicate built, the kind that were paid specifically for their willingness to follow someone into the dark and drag them back out. They wore no colors, no markings. They didn't need to. Dennis knew what they were the moment he saw how they moved. Not like soldiers, but like collectors. Patient, certain, already calculating the distance between themselves and their property. They didn't see him until he stepped into the torchlight. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't speak. He simply stopped walking and stood there, in the rain, in the full and considerable fact of himself. 6'9" of absolute stillness, amber eyes tracking both men with the mild, unhurried attention of something that has never once had to justify its place at the top of anything. The first tracker stopped so abruptly, the second walked into him. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then they were gone, back through the gate, footsteps swallowed by the rain, not a word exchanged between them. Men like that had a finely developed instinct for which situations constituted a reasonable risk. This was not one of those situations. Dennis turned. The girl had collapsed against the courtyard wall, one hand braced on the stone, the other arm cradled against her chest. She was staring at him with storm-gray eyes so wide they caught the torchlight whole, her breathing coming in short, tearing gasps. She did not run. He didn't know if that was courage, or if she had simply nothing left to run on. He crossed the courtyard slowly, deliberately, the way he'd learned to move years ago, in another context entirely. Carefully, always making sure there was time to adjust to the space he occupied. He stopped 6 feet away. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He crouched down, brought himself level with her, made himself, as much as a man like him ever could, small. "Are you hurt?" She stared at him. The most terrifying thing she had ever seen, he could tell. It was written plainly across every feature. And still, after a moment that stretched long enough to hold a whole history inside it, she gave a single, exhausted nod. Yes. He didn't look away. "All right," he said quietly. "You're safe now." He wasn't sure she believed him, but she didn't argue, and she didn't run. For Dennis Harrow, in that particular moment, that was everything. Chapter 3. The claim arrived before breakfast. A syndicate courier, clean-suited professionally, unbothered, the kind of man whose entire livelihood depended on treating human beings as line items, delivered the documentation to Ironvale's receiving hall at first light. Heather of no registered family, Omega classification, serial number pressed in red ink at the bottom of the page like a brand. Property of the Greyvale Acquisition Consortium. Unlawfully removed from contracted custody. Return requested under Article 9 of the Omega Statutes, by authority of the Territorial Commerce Accord. Legal. Airtight. Filed in triplicate. The council was assembled by the time Dennis had read it twice. They were already in agreement before he arrived. He could tell by the way they arranged themselves, the particular geometry of people who have collectively decided something and are now simply waiting to deliver it. Fenwick spoke first, as he always did when the news was unpleasant enough that someone needed to absorb the initial reaction. The law was clear, he said. The consortium's claim was valid. Any interference would constitute a breach of the Commerce Accord, which governed trade relationships across 4 of the 7 territories. The political cost of defiance was not inconsiderable. The girl, regrettably, would need to be returned. Dennis let him finish. He was courteous that way. Then he stood, straightened to his full height, which had the immediate effect of making the ceiling feel lower and the room feel smaller, picked up the syndicate's documentation, and walked out. They found him in the Great Hall 60 seconds later, which was approximately how long it took them to realize he wasn't coming back to the table. The hall was occupied. Stewards, attendants, 2 foreign trade liaisons who had arrived that morning and were now deeply regretting their timing, and Lord Cassell, who stood near the eastern pillar with a goblet of morning wine and an expression of studied neutrality that Dennis had never once trusted. Dennis walked to the center of the hall. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The Omega called Heather is under royal sanctuary, effective this morning by my word and my authority. He set the syndicate's papers on the floor, not thrown, not dramatic, simply placed face down, as though they were no longer relevant to any conversation worth having. Any party wishing to contest that claim is welcome to do so, now, in this room. The hall was very quiet. The trade liaisons studied the middle distance with intense focus. Fenwick opened his mouth and then, apparently reconsidering the acoustics of the situation, closed it again. The courier who had delivered the documents had already ceased to exist as far as anyone present was concerned. No one spoke. Dennis nodded once, as though something had been agreed upon, and turned to leave. Across the hall, Lord Cassell took a slow sip of wine. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes, pale, patient, and suddenly very attentive, tracked the king's exit, with the quiet calculation of a man who has just watched a door open that he fully intends to walk through. The girl, he was already thinking, would be very useful indeed. Chapter 4. He had sent the physician away twice. The first time, Heather hadn't understood why. The second time, she watched Dennis open the door, exchange a few quiet words with the woman waiting in the corridor, and close it again with a finality that invited no further discussion. He came back to the chair beside her cot, carrying a bowl of clean water and a roll of linen bandage, and he moved with the particular carefulness of someone navigating a space they didn't entirely trust themselves inside. "You didn't have to do that," Heather said. "You were watching her like you were waiting for her to do something worse than the wound already had." He set the bowl down. "I've had enough of people not being given a choice about who touches them." She didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to say to it that wouldn't have cost her more composure than she currently had available. He pulled his chair close, not close enough to crowd, she noticed, always that careful calibration of distance, and turned his attention to her arm. The gash had clotted overnight, but it needed cleaning and closing, and she'd been bracing for the handling of it since she woke. She watched his hands come into her periphery and felt the instinctive flinch move through her before she could stop it. He stopped immediately. Hands suspended, not withdrawn, not retreated, simply stopped, waiting. "I'm all right," she said. "You don't have to be." He waited another moment, and then, with her small nod, continued. And that was when she started watching him properly. Because what his hands did next didn't match any version of those hands she would have imagined. They were enormous. Scarred at the knuckles, thick through the palm, built by decades of war into instruments of considerable and well-documented destruction. She had seen him turn 2 grown men into a retreat with nothing but his stillness. These were not hands that the world had ever asked to be gentle. And yet, he cleaned the wound in increments so small and so deliberate that she felt almost nothing. The cloth moved like a question rather than a statement, checking before it committed, adjusting at the first suggestion of her breath changing. He didn't grip. he didn't hold. He provided just enough contact to accomplish the task, and no more, as though he was operating under a strict internal accounting of how much of himself he was permitted to impose on any given moment. He was barely breathing. She realized it slowly, and then all at once. The held breath, the rigid precision. The way his jaw was set, not with concentration, but with something older and more practiced than that. He was afraid. Not of her. Not of the wound or the work. He was afraid of himself, of the hands, of the size, of what he'd been told so many times that he was. Heather looked at his face. He didn't notice. He was too focused on the careful, impossible project of making himself safe for someone else. She did not look away. Chapter 5. Lady Vora had called it a formal introduction. The invitation had been worded with exquisite courtesy, a simple presentation of the king's guests to the assembled court, a matter of protocol, nothing more. Heather had worn the plainest dress she could find in the wardrobe they'd provided, which was still finer than anything she'd owned in the 3 years before Ironvale. Dennis had said nothing on the walk to the hall, but his silence had a texture to it. She was learning to read, tight across the shoulders, jaw set, the particular quiet of a man who knows what is coming and has decided in advance not to give it the satisfaction of a reaction. She understood why within 4 minutes of arriving. Lady Vora stood at the head of the hall with a sheaf of documents and the bright performative warmth of someone has rehearsed their cruelty until it gleams. She began with introductions, yes, formally, graciously, and then pivoted with the smoothness of long practice into what she called relevant testimony, gathered, she explained, in the interest of transparency, for the court's awareness, for the protection of all parties involved. Then she began to read. The noble women's accounts were presented without names, but with generous detail, clinical in structure, devastating in content, each one a careful portrait of shock and revulsion, dressed in the language of concern. The court absorbed the first testimony in silence. By the second, there were smiles. By the fourth, laughter, genuine, unguarded, the kind that fills a room and keeps filling it. Lady Vora read with her eyes slightly downcast, the picture of reluctance, pausing at intervals to let the reaction breathe. Dennis sat in his chair at the center of it all, like a man who had decided to become stone. He did not move, did not blink in any way that communicated feeling. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, and he stared at a point in the middle distance, and he absorbed it, all of it, with the practiced endurance of someone who has been absorbing this particular thing for a very long time. Heather stood up. It wasn't dramatic. She simply rose from her chair, and something about the quality of the movement, its quietness, its absence of hesitation, pulled the nearest laughter short. Lady Vora paused mid-sentence. "You've gathered testimony," Heather said, "from women who encountered something they didn't understand, and called it monstrous because that was easier than examining their own fear." Her voice was even, conversational almost. "You've dressed their embarrassment in parchment and read it aloud in front of the man they failed, and you're calling it transparency." She looked at Lady Vora with the steady, unimpressed attention of someone who has survived considerably worse than this room. "That's not testimony. That's a group of women who were too small for a great man, performing their smallness for an audience." The laughter was gone. Lady Vora's mouth closed. The hall was absolutely silent, and into that silence, Dennis turned and looked at Heather, not with gratitude, not with relief, but with something rawer and more unguarded than either. The expression of a man encountering, for the first time, the precise and unfamiliar experience of being defended. He didn't look away either. Chapter 6. He found her in the war garden just after the second bell. She was sitting on the low stone wall that bordered the nightshade row, her feet tucked beneath her, looking out at the dark geometry of plants that had no business being beautiful, and were anyway. She didn't startle when he approached. She was learning his footsteps, the particular weight of them, the way the ground acknowledged him before she had to. He sat beside her, left a careful foot of space between them, as always. For a while, neither of them spoke, and the garden held them in its specific silence, the kind that exists between two people who have spent the day surviving the same thing from different angles and haven't yet found the words to compare notes. Then Dennis said, "The first one was Lady Corwin, of the Azure Coast." He said it the way people begin confessions, without preamble, as though the decision to speak had been made somewhere below the level of conscious thought and had simply arrived. "I was 24. She was the first candidate the council arranged after my coronation. We had one evening together." He paused. "She left before it was over. I heard her laughing in the corridor outside." Heather said nothing. She was watching his profile. "The fifth was worse. She didn't laugh." His voice was level, uninflected, the tone of a man recounting weather patterns rather than the systematic dismantling of his own self-worth. "She wept, told me she was sorry, that it wasn't my fault, that she hoped I found someone." He stopped. "As though I was an unfortunate situation to be managed rather than a person to be known." He told her about the 14th after that. And then the 17th. Each one delivered in the same exhausted, unadorned honesty, stripped entirely of the performance of strength that she suspected he wore like armor in every other room of this fortress. Out here, in the dark, among the poisonous flowers, he had apparently decided to put it down. When he finished, the silence returned. Different now, heavier and somehow cleaner. Heather reached out and took his hand. Both of hers wrapped around one of his, which was an architectural undertaking, given the proportions involved, but she managed it, and she held on with the deliberate firmness of someone making a point without words. She felt him stop breathing entirely. She looked up at him. "I'm not leaving." He looked down at her, and she could see it move, through him, the want to believe her, and the long, load-bearing wall of evidence he'd spent 19 rejections building against exactly that kind of hope. He didn't believe her yet. It was written plainly in every line of his face. But he wanted to. And wanting, she understood, was where everything had to begin. She wasn't entirely sure which of them moved first, only that the distance closed, slowly, carefully, with the tentativeness of two people handling something neither had held before. His mouth against hers was impossibly gentle, a question with no pressure attached to it, offered and waiting. She answered it. Around them, the nightshade bloomed dark and quiet, indifferent and perfect, keeping their secrets in the patient way that poisonous things do. Chapter 7. They met in the undercroft beneath the west wing, where the torches were few and the stones absorbed sound like a confession. Lady Vora arrived first, as she always did, punctuality being the one virtue she practiced without irony. Lord Cassell came 2 minutes later, unhurried, carrying no light of his own, which Heather would later think was the most honest thing about him. He had never needed to illuminate anything. He simply moved through the dark that other people provided and called it navigation. He set a small case on the table between them, opened it. Inside, nestled in black cloth, sat a vial no larger than a man's thumb. The liquid inside was colorless. It looked like water. It looked like nothing at all, which was, the alchemist who'd sourced it had explained, precisely the point. Cassell had paid considerably for it. He considered the investment sound. 1 vial, he said, dissolved into the ceremonial wine before the opening toast. The reaction begins within 4 minutes of consumption. He closed the case. Elevated aggression, territorial response, complete loss of higher reasoning. Everything the court has always suspected lives beneath his restraint, made suddenly and publicly true. He paused to let that settle. Before the foreign ambassadors, before the full noble assembly, Ironvale's king, finally revealed as exactly what we've always called him. Lady Vora looked at the case for a moment. And the girl, removed beforehand, for her own protection. The pause he left around the phrase was architectural, just enough space to communicate that they both understood what it meant, and neither needed to say it plainly. The Eastern Tower, a precaution officially. She'll be contained before the feast begins. Once Cassel is declared regent and Dennis is restrained, the consortium's claim is reinstated. She goes back to the syndicate as a gesture of diplomatic goodwill toward our new trade partners. Lady Vora smoothed the front of her gown with one hand. She'll resist. She's one Omega in a tower with a locked door. He picked up the case. She's not the variable I'm concerned about. The plan was clean. That was what Cassel valued above. Sentiment. Above ambition even. Cleanliness. The elegance of a mechanism that required no improvisation, because every contingency had been accounted for in advance. Dennis's size, his legend, his 19 rejections, years of accumulated court whisper and noblewoman testimony, all of it ammunition, all of it suddenly useful. You didn't need to invent a monster. You simply needed to show the one that was already there. The serum would do the rest. Heather was moved to the Eastern Tower the following afternoon. The chamberlain who delivered the news was apologetic, professional, and entirely unwilling to meet her eyes. Precautionary measure, he said. The feast presented certain security considerations. She would be comfortable. She would be safe. The door locked from the outside. She stood at the narrow window and watched the courtyard below fill with the preparations for a feast she understood, with a cold and gathering certainty. She was never meant to survive. Chapter 8. She heard them through the servants' access door at the base of the tower stairs. Two voices, low, transactional, the conversation of people distributing tasks rather than making decisions, which meant the decisions had already been made elsewhere by someone else. She caught fragments at first. Ceremonial wine, opening toast. Keep her contained until it's done. Then a word she recognized from her time with the consortium. A word that lived in the specific vocabulary of people who treated other people as logistics. Returned. She didn't move until the footsteps faded. Then she sat on the edge of the cot and breathed through it. The fear, the cold, the particular clarity that arrives when a situation strips itself down to its simplest components. Dennis was at the feast. The wine was already poisoned or would be soon. She was in a locked tower with a door she couldn't open and a window she hadn't yet measured for possibility. She crossed to the window. Second story. 20 feet to the courtyard stone, maybe 22. The curtains were heavy brocade, old and thick. She'd noticed them when she arrived, because noticing things had kept her alive for 3 years before Iron Veil, and the habit didn't stop at the gate. She pulled them down, tore the fabric into lengths with hands that were steadier than she'd expected, knotted them with the grim efficiency of someone who has learned that competence is just fear with a task assigned to it. She tied one end to the window frame's iron fitting, dropped the rest. It reached, barely. The drop from the rope's end to the ground was still several feet, and she landed badly, one ankle turned on the wet stone, pain flaring sharp and immediate. And then she was up, because stopping was not a variable she had included in this plan. The Ashwood marshes lay between the palace's eastern wall and the feast hall's rear entrance. She had seen them from the tower window at dusk, dark, flat, threaded with water she couldn't gauge the depth of. She went in anyway. The ground disappeared beneath her third step. Mud to the knee, cold enough to erase the ankle entirely, which was almost a kindness. She pulled free and kept moving. Something large shifted in the tree line to her left and paced her for 100 yards, before apparently concluding she wasn't worth the effort. Or perhaps that whatever was driving her forward was something it preferred not to involve itself with. She lost her footing at the creek, went into the thigh, caught herself on a half-submerged branch, hauled across to the other bank where the ice shelf at the edge cracked under her, and opened her feet on its edges in ways she catalogued and set aside for later. She did not stop. She had told him she wasn't leaving. She had meant it as comfort then, as reassurance. as the best true thing she had to offer a man who had never been given a reason to believe it. She meant it differently now. She meant it as a promise with legs, as a thing she intended to make physically, bodily, undeniably real. The feast hall lights appeared through the trees ahead, warm and gold and entirely indifferent to what it had cost her to reach them. She ran toward them anyway. Chapter 9. The servants' door hit the wall like a thunderclap. Every head in the Grand Triumph Hall turned. Ambassadors, nobles, council members, attendants frozen mid-pour, all of them pivoting toward the small, soaked, barefoot figure standing in the doorway with the marsh mud to her thighs and blood-tracing dark lines down both feet across the pale stone floor. Dennis. Not a scream in the end. Just his name, aimed at him like an arrow that had traveled a very long way to arrive. He was already setting down the goblet. He hadn't drunk from it. She would learn this later, would learn that he had been watching Cassell all evening with the patient, peripheral attention of a man who has survived enough politics to recognize when a room has been arranged rather than assembled. The seating, the positioning of the ceremonial server, new-faced and too careful. The way Cassell's eyes had tracked the wine from the moment it was poured. Dennis had held the goblet through 3 courses and 2 toasts and had not once brought it to his lips, because something in the evening's geometry had been wrong in a way he couldn't yet name. He could name it now. He set the goblet down with the same deliberate quietness with which he did everything. No drama, no flourish. And stood. The hall, which had already been silent, somehow became more so. He looked at Heather across the full length of the room, took in the marsh water and the blood, and the fact that she was upright at all, and something moved through his face that he didn't bother concealing. Then he turned to Cassell. "The wine," he said. Conversational, almost gentle. "Would you like to tell me what's in it, or would you prefer I have it tested in front of everyone currently seated at this table?" Cassell's expression didn't break. It was a masterwork of composure, held for 2 full seconds, 3, long enough that a lesser room might have been persuaded. Then something behind his eyes made a calculation, arrived at an answer, and discarded the composure entirely. "You have no proof of anything," he said. "I have a witness who overheard your instructions to the chamberlain. I have a server who was paid from your personal account, which my treasurer will confirm by morning. I have 19 years of your patience, Cassell, and I have always known that patience like yours is waiting for something." Dennis picked up the goblet and held it out toward the nearest ambassador, a woman from the northern reaches who had been sitting very still for the past several minutes, with the alert, assessing expression of someone filing everything away for a detailed report later. "1 vial," he said, "dissolved in ceremonial wine. I'm told the reaction is quite dramatic." The ambassador looked at the goblet, then at Cassell. Then she sat back in her chair and folded her hands and said nothing, which was its own kind of verdict. Cassell lunged, not at Dennis, at the decorative sword mounted on the pillar to his left, ceremonial but functional, which Dennis had noted upon arrival because he always noted weapons. It was simply how his mind was organized. Cassell got his hand on the hilt. He did not get it off the wall. Dennis crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and stopped Cassell's arm at the wrist with 1 hand. Just 1. He didn't squeeze, didn't twist, simply held with the absolute and total authority of a man demonstrating the difference between force and violence, between what he was capable of and what he chose. Cassell strained against it for a moment that seemed from the outside almost instructive. Then he stopped. "I am going to release your wrist," Dennis said quietly, "and you are going to sit down." He did. Cassell did. Lady Vora, across the table, made a sound that began as composure and ended as weeping. No one moved to comfort her. The guards came. The arrests were orderly. The hall remained very, very quiet throughout, in the manner of people collectively revising something they had believed for a long time. Dennis walked to Heather. She was still standing in the servant's doorway, the adrenaline visibly leaving her now, her legs making preliminary arguments about their continued cooperation. He crossed the entire length of the hall, and when he reached her, he did what he had spent years learning not to do. He took up all the space he had, all of it, and wrapped his arms around her completely, her whole frame inside the shelter of his, with the devastating and precise gentleness of a man who has finally understood what he was built for. Not war, not dominance, not the performance of power for rooms full of people who would always find a reason to be afraid. This. Exactly this. She pressed her face against his chest and felt the exhale move through him, enormous, long, the release of something that had been held for 19 rejections, and a lifetime of making himself smaller than he was. "I told you," she said into the warmth of him. "I wasn't leaving." "I know," he said, and this time he believed her. They were married before the month ended, on a morning when the war garden was frost-tipped and the nightshade bloomed late and improbable in the cold. The Omega Protection Accords were signed on the same day, witnessed by the Northern Ambassador and 7 territorial representatives, and 1 council member, who wept through the entire proceedings and would later claim it was allergies. That night, in the quiet of their first evening as king and queen, Heather took his hand. She held it the way she had in the garden, both of hers around one of his, and then she guided it, slowly, to rest low against her stomach. Dennis went very still. She looked up at him. His amber eyes, which had silenced, war rooms and turned syndicate trackers into retreat, were doing something she had never seen them do before, something that had no military application whatsoever. "Oh," he said. "Just that," she smiled. "Yes." Dennis Harrow, the Colossus of Iron Vale, the weapon, the beast, the man rejected by every woman in 7 territories, spread his enormous, careful, battle-scarred hand across the warmth of her, and understood, with a certainty that required no council approval, and no court testimony, and no further evidence of any kind, that every rejection had been a door closing on a room he was never meant to stay in. He had been walking toward this one all along,